I've been terrified lately of death. Not so much the dimming of the light or the stepping through the door as the incessant plodding upon the path to that long-determined destination. We know not when we'll arrive until we have, and then it won't matter when we arrive because then there'll be no when. All our yesterdays crumple into a single I was. Every long-held I will becomes I wish I had. Every tomorrow was just a stepping stone to oblivion. So I say, tomorrow I will die. Not in the next 24 hours, most likely not in the 24 next, probably not the next 24 years, but a day will come whereupon tomorrow fades into a placeless mist. I and you will arrive at the vast crossroads where all people arrive. And the signpost there points behind us, labeling each our roads with our name and our deeds, but the one road departing is labeled tomorrow, to the morrow of eternity. And if every tomorrow until that place is nothing but a gray smudge filling the void, then what does it matter if I cut to the chase? Why plod along at this tedious pace day after day after day, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow to the last syllable of recorded time? Macbeth gave up his sanity to say so much. I gave up only my Netflix subscription. Can you imagine that all of life, every heartbeat, every stale sunrise, was constructed, breathed out, only to escape from ennui? That boredom is our greatest enemy, and death our only respite? Well, then why not embrace him as a friend? That's really what I'm terrified of. That you and I have no great stakes, no soul to redeem from our sins, no mind to cultivate through art, only the prerogative to keep ourselves entertained, no, worse, unbored, just distracted enough by the light of our screens not to notice the darkness from the upcoming abyss. Hour by hour, just the fun you need to keep that fatal truth away, that every tomorrow is the same, one more lamppost lighting fools the way to dusty death. And of course I'm completely correct. There is nothing but distraction or death. It is impossible to prove otherwise. If we want to reject that premise, we can only assume that there is something like a soul, something like a mind that is worth keeping alive, even if it's just for one day, something it might learn, something it might do that has some effect on some part of the world, or something like itself in some other person. Something. What is it? Somebody has to know. And I've also been terrified that my microphone isn't recording my voice very well, and that it'll negatively affect my audiobooks. In the case of the latter, I've contrived this mic test so that I can edit the settings accordingly. Against the former, though, because I am a coward and can only flee in the face of such terror, all I can do is assume that there is something. It might be a flawed assumption, but as long as it grants me just one more day, a long cut to that inevitable crossroads, I'll take it. And so if we are to pick soul, if we are to assume that there is something, then we must also take a look at the fruits of that something, namely, the most important thing, which is love. Not love, L-U-R-V, as some people pretend that love is, but love in its entirety, L-O-V-E. Now, there happens to be a fair amount of overlap. And I think it's very certain that your introduction to a meaningful and powerful love can only be attained first by stepping into the realm of lerv, L-U-R-V. To that end, I wanted to, in this mic test, read one of the most stunning sections from early Anna Karenina, which is a novel that I have been reading on my channel intermittently over the past 3 years. And I wanted to dedicate it to this idea of love as the first step on the path to love. And furthermore, that feeling of utter elation, right? That those butterflies in your stomach, that feeling that something is warping into your world in a magical way, that happens when you first step into love. I'm speaking, of course, about a certain kind of love at first sight that thrills you through even as you remember it later, as you think about perhaps the sound of her laughter, or the way she said your name, or the shape of her lips, whatever it happened to have drawn you to this particular person in your very first meeting with each other. All the emotions that precipitated that and then furthered it until it grew and blossomed into a more complete, well, first of all, a more complete love, and then secondly, a more complete love. I wanted to present to you an example of that love at first sight feeling from Anna Karenina. And I really believe that this is one of the most powerful emotions that a person can have. And powerful emotions are revelatory in the literal sense. In Latin, revelation means unveiling, right? And I think powerful emotions have that unveiling effect, wherein this materialistic point of view that I was detailing at the start of this video gets pulled away. More like rots away, it can't stand the beauty of the truth. It can't stand the nature of the soul. It can't stand the fact that these things exist, and they scatter like orcs in sunlight. I don't know. But, so yes, emotions. And especially this one emotion that rules your heart, which can only be attributed to this one specific woman or man, depending on, your personal tastes. I think that emotion is one of the most powerful things that can be experienced. If you're more of a cynic, then you tend to laugh at it, and I used to be the same, until it came sort of crashing into my life unannounced and undesired, at which point, of course, I had to say, oh, fuck, I can't believe you've done this, right? Because then all the cynicism just, is meaningless, which is hilarious and ironic. I fully realize that meaninglessness itself becomes meaningless in the face of such a primal emotion. That's what emotions are good at. Since then, scenes that represented this sudden collision of two souls, right? This intrusion into their daily lives with a force so powerful that it upends everything about them, have started to become particularly interesting to me. And I've been looking out for them and studying them to see how they pull that emotion out. A couple that I thought I'd mention here before we get to the Anna Karenina scene. In the Snyder Cut of Justice League, there's a particularly good visual representation of this, which is very difficult to do. But The Flash has this one scene where he saves his girlfriend or something like that, or he meets her for the first time then, but she doesn't become his romantic interest until later. I haven't seen the Snyder Cut, so I don't actually know what happens between these two people, but the message is blatant and the effect is palpable. There's also Torval and Dean's Bolero, which is widely regarded as probably the best choreographed skating routine of all time. And it starts with the two of them kneeling, right? They're not skating. And they're sort of doing this weird dance with each other. And it's sort of meant to show, right, the social rigors required to introduce two people to one another even before they ultimately fly into this wild and tempestuous relationship that is doomed, right? The skating routine represents as a whole a doomed romance, and it starts with this mating ritual essentially where the two of them are introduced to each other. There's also, of course, Romeo and Juliet, which obviously there's a scene where the two of them meet for the first time, but the whole play is written as though humans behave in the throes of this utmost passion for their entire lives, right? It's written in a world where everyone behaves as though they are captivated by their first loves for the first time ever, which is not good, and which is why it ultimately ends in tragedy, but it's showing you what that love is like. And before we get to Anna Karenina, which indeed, from Anna's perspective, is about that same passion, and before we read how Kitty and Levin themselves share in this particular passion of the first encounter of true love, I thought I'd actually read straight up Romeo and Juliet, the scene where they see each other for the first time at the masked ball, which over the past couple of years has been every ball, but this one is more like Halloween masks, if that needed to be clarified. This is Act 1, Scene 5, or else I'm a fool. And once upon a time, in the throes of my own passionate love, I actually wrote these words into a song, which I do not care to share to anyone ever. But yes, let's get into it. Romeo says to a serving man, "What lady's that, which doth enrich the hand of yonder knight?" Servant says, "I know not, sir." Oh, she doth teach the torches to burn bright. It seems she hangs upon the cheek of night like a rich jewel in an Ethiop's ear. Beauty too rich for use, for earth too dear. So shows a snowy dove trooping with crows, as yonder lady o'er her fellows shows. The measure done, I'll watch her place of stand, and, touching hers, make blessed my rude hand. Did my heart love till now? Forswear it, sight, for I never saw true beauty till this night. At this point, Tybalt comes in and he's like, "Yo, that's a Montague, let's kill him." Which, by the way, is where that famous song comes from. Yeah, that's literally Tybalt's theme, which is introduced at this precise moment, as he's sitting there looking at Romeo, thinking to himself, "Dude, is this guy trying to hit on my cousin?" Eventually, his uncle is like, "Yo, let Romeo be, he's just here to have fun with the masks." At which point, Romeo goes to Juliet and says, "If I profane with my unworthiest hand this holy shrine, the gentle fine is this. My lips, two blushing pilgrims, ready stand to smooth that rough touch with a tender kiss." And Juliet says, "Good pilgrim, you do wrong your hand too much, which mannerly devotion shows in this, for saints have hands that pilgrims' hands do touch, and palm to palm is holy palmer's kiss. Have not saints lips, and holy palmers too? Aye, pilgrim, lips that they must use in prayer. Oh, then, dear saint, let lips do what hands do. They pray, grant thou, lest faith turn to despair. Saints do not move, though grant for prayer's sake. Then move not, while my prayer's effect I take. Thus from my lips by thine, my sin is purged. Mwah! Huh. Then have my lips the sin that they have took." "Sin? From my lips? Oh, trespass sweetly urged, give me my sin again." "You kiss by the book." At which point the nurse comes in and says, "Excuse me, Juliet, your mother wants to talk to you." And Romeo says, "What is her mother?" Which, of course, in common language today sounds completely ridiculous. Like, what is her mother? Is she some kind of app that warns you when you're flirting too much? I don't think so. And then the nurse says, of course, yeah, her mother is what is hosting this party. So unless you want to get kicked out, I suggest you keep your mouth... Keep my daughter out your fucking mouth. Wow, dude, it was a G.I. Jane joke. Keep my daughter out your fucking mouth. I'm going to, okay? That was the greatest night in the history of masked balls. Okay, I think I'm mixing up scripts a little bit here, so let's get back on track. The point is, yeah, you can see from Romeo here that he's completely smitten by Juliet. But there's a secondary point here, which absolutely every guy ever knows, which is that women are terrifying, especially if you love them. And this, I want you to keep in mind because it comes up again in the Anna Karenina scene, the way that Tolstoy has Levin describe his fascination with Kitty, and how that's tied to his complete lack of self-worth, a sense of the diminishment of his own self-worth. That's more correct. It's not that he thinks that he is worthless, but rather, in light of her, there is nothing that could be worthy enough. And yeah, like that's true. That is correct. And ultimately, the point when love becomes love is when that is triumphed over. It's the moment when you realize loving someone is not in spite of your self-worth, but rather it is the fulfillment of your self-worth. You come to completion. You come to your rightful responsibility as a lover of someone by loving someone. And thus you achieve your self-worth. You don't just have it prematurely and then present it like a medal on your military uniform or something. And should you fail to do that, should you fail to resolve your love into love, then inevitably you will return to that materialistic belief that I had before. You will despair of love and ultimately despair of a deeper meaning to life. Which leads, of course, most often to suicide, hence Romeo and Juliet, hence the tragic death at the end of Torval and Dean's Bolero, hence Vronsky in Anna in Anna Karenina, and a lot of the despair that Levin displays in the upcoming segments. So yes, that's a good enough introduction and a long enough introduction. So I'm gonna end the preamble here, and I'm going to read to you chapter 0 of Anna Karenina Abridged. But chapter something, I think it's like chapter 6 onwards of part 1 of Anna Karenina proper, wherein Levin meets Kitty for the first time in the story. Some quick context, Kitty's older sister Dolly is married to a guy called Stepan Arkadevich Oblonsky, and he is friends with Levin, and of course Levin is in love with Kitty. And Oblonsky has just told Levin in the previous chapter that Kitty is going skating this afternoon with her mother, and the two of them will be at the skating rink at the park. So speaking of skating with Torval and Dean, skating of course figures here as well. One of the reasons that this scene figures among my favorites is because of the fact that they are skating. I'm a huge fan of skating myself. It's so fun. It is unbelievably fun. So much so that I find it difficult to believe that people don't just skate around everywhere. Like, why would you make roads of asphalt if you could possibly make roads of ice? Especially, I'm living up in Canada, so it seems feasible that you might be able to make roads of ice and you could just skate everywhere. And it's so weird to me that people would not want to do that. But maybe I'm just passionately in love with skating. All right, let's get into this reading. When Oblonsky asked Levin what had brought him to town, Levin blushed and was furious with himself for blushing, because he could not answer, "I have come to make your sister-in-law an offer," though that was precisely what he had come for. The families of the Levins and the Shtcherbatskayas were old, noble Moscow families, and had always been on intimate and friendly terms. This intimacy had grown still closer during Levin's student days. He had both prepared for the university with the young Prince Shtcherbatsky, the brother of Kitty and Dolly, and had entered at the same time with him. In those days, Levin used often to be in the Shtcherbatskys' house, and he was in love with the Shtcherbatskaya household. Strange as it may appear, it was with the household, the family, that Konstantin Levin was in love, especially with the feminine half of the household. Levin did not remember his own mother, and his only sister was older than he was, so that it was in the Shtcherbatskaya's house that he saw for the first time that inner life of an old, noble, cultivated, and honorable family, of which he had been deprived by the death of his father and mother. All the members of that family, especially the feminine half, were pictured by him, as it were, wrapped about with a mysterious poetical veil. And he not only perceived no defects whatever in them, but under the poetical veil that shrouded them, he assumed the existence of the loftiest sentiments and every possible perfection. Why it was the three young ladies had one day to speak French and the next English. Why it was that at certain hours they played by turns on the piano, the sounds of which were audible in their brother's room above where the students used to work. Why they were visited by those professors of French literature, of music, of drawing, of dancing. Why, at certain hours, all the three young ladies, when Mademoiselle Linon drove in the coach to the Tversky Boulevard, dressed in their satin cloaks, Dolly in a long one, Natalia in a half-long one, Kitty in one so short that her shapely legs in tightly drawn red stockings were visible to all beholders. Why it was they had to walk about the Tversky Boulevard, escorted by a footman with a gold cockade in his hat. All this and much more that was done in their mysterious world he did not understand. But he was sure that everything that was done there was very good, and he was in love precisely with the mystery of the proceedings. In his student days he had all but been in love with the eldest, Dolly, but she was soon married to Oblonsky. Then he began being in love with the second. He felt, as it were, that he had to be in love with one of the sisters, only he could not quite make out which. But Natalia, too, had hardly made her appearance in the world when she married the diplomat, Lvov. Kitty was still a child when Levin left the university. Young Prince Sherbatsky went into the navy, was drowned in the Baltic, and Levin's relations with the Sherbatskayas, in spite of his relationship with Oblonsky, became less intimate. But when early in the winter of this year Levin came to Moscow, after a year in the country, and saw the Sherbatskayas, he realized which of the three sisters he was indeed destined to love. One would have thought that nothing could be simpler than for him, a man of good family, rather rich than poor, and 32 years old, to make the young Princess Sherbatskaya an offer of marriage. In all likelihood, he would at once have been looked upon as a good match. But Levin was in love, and so it seemed to him that Kitty was so perfect in every respect that she was a creature far above everything earthly, and that he was a creature so low and so earthly that it could not even be conceived that other people and she herself could regard him as worthy of her. After spending 2 months in Moscow in a state of enchantment, seeing Kitty almost every day in society into which he went so as to meet her, he abruptly decided that it could not be, and went back to the country. Levin's conviction that it could not be was founded on the idea that in the eyes of her family, he was a disadvantageous and worthless match for the charming Kitty, and that Kitty herself could not love him. In her family's eyes, he had no ordinary, definite career and position in society, while his contemporaries by this time, when he was 32, were already one a colonel, another a professor, another director of a bank and railways, or president of a board, like Oblonsky. But he knew very well how he must appear to others, was a country gentleman, occupied in breeding cattle, shooting game, building barns, in other words, a fellow of no ability, who had not turned out well, who was doing just what, according to the ideas of the world, is done by people fit for nothing else. The mysterious, enchanting Kitty herself could not love such an ugly person as he conceived himself to be, and above all, such an ordinary, in no way striking person. Moreover, his attitude to Kitty in the past, the attitude of a grown-up person to a child, arising from his friendship with her brother, seemed to him yet another obstacle to love. An ugly, good-natured man, as he considered himself, might, he supposed, be liked as a friend, but to be loved with such a love as that which he loved Kitty, one would need to be a handsome, and still more, a distinguished man. He had heard that women often did care for ugly and ordinary men, but he did not believe it, for he judged by himself, and he could not himself have loved any but beautiful, mysterious, and exceptional women. But after spending 2 months alone in the country, he was convinced that this was not one of those passions of which he had had experience in his early youth, that this feeling gave him not an instant's rest, that he could not live without deciding the question, would she or would she not be his wife, and that his despair had arisen only from his own imaginings, that he had no sort of proof that he would be rejected. And he had now come to Moscow with a firm determination to make an offer and get married if he were accepted. Or he could not conceive what would become of him if he were rejected. At 4 o'clock, conscious of his throbbing heart, Levin stepped out of a hired sledge at the zoological gardens and turned along the path to the frozen mounds and the skating ground, knowing that he would certainly find her there, as he had seen the Sherbatskaya's carriage at the entrance. It was a bright, frosty day. Rows of carriages, sledges, drivers, and policemen were standing in the approach. Crowds of well-dressed people, with hats bright in the sun, swarmed about the entrance and along the well-swept little paths between the little houses adorned with carving in the Russian style. The old curly birches of the gardens, all their twigs laden with snow, looked as though freshly decked in sacred vestments. He walked along the path towards the skating ground and kept saying to himself, "You mustn't be excited. You must be calm." "What's the matter with you? What do you want? Be quiet, stupid," he conjured his heart. And the more he tried to compose himself, the more breathless he found himself. An acquaintance met him and called him by his name, but Levin did not even recognize him. He went towards the mounds, whence came the clank of the chains of sledges as they slipped down or were dragged up, the rumble of the sliding sledges, and the sounds of merry voices. He walked on a few steps, and the skating ground lay open before his eyes, and at once, amidst all the skaters, he knew her. He knew she was there by the rapture and the terror that seized on his heart. She was standing talking to a lady at the opposite end of the ground. There was apparently nothing striking either in her dress or her attitude, but for Levin she was as easy to find in that crowd as a rose among nettles. Everything was made bright by her. She was the smile that shed light on all round her. "Is it possible I can go over there on the ice? Go up to her?" he thought. The place where she stood seemed to him a holy shrine, unapproachable, and there was one moment when he was almost retreating, so overwhelmed was he with terror. He had to make an effort to master himself and to remind himself that people of all sorts were moving about her, and that he too might come there to skate. He walked down for a long while, avoiding looking at her as at the sun, but seeing her as one does the sun without looking. On that day of the week and at that time of day, people of one set, all acquainted with one another, used to meet on the ice. There were crack skaters there showing off their skill, and learners clinging to chairs with timid, awkward movements. There were also boys and elderly people skating to keep their health. They seemed to Levin an elect band of blissful beings because they were here, near her. All the skaters, it seemed, with perfect self-possession, skated towards her, skated by her, even spoke to her, and were happy, quite apart from her, enjoying the capital ice and the fine weather. Nikolai Sherbatsky, Kitty's cousin, in a short jacket and tight trousers, was sitting on a garden seat with his skates on. Seeing Levin, he shouted to him, "Ah, the premier skater in Russia! You been here long? First-rate ice. Do put your skates on." "I haven't got my skates," Levin answered, marveling at this boldness and ease in her presence, and not for 1 second losing sight of her, though he did not look at her. He felt as though the sun were coming near him. She was in a corner, and turning out her slender feet in their high boots with obvious timidity, she skated towards him. A boy in Russian dress, desperately waving his arms and bowed down to the ground, overtook her. She skated a little uncertainly. Taking her hands out of the little muff that hung on a cord, she held them ready for emergency, and looking towards Levin, whom she had recognized, she smiled at him and at her own fears. When she had got round the turn, she gave herself a push off with one foot and skated straight up to Nikolai. Clutching at his arm, she nodded, smiling to Levin. She was more splendid than he had imagined her. When he thought of her, he could call up a vivid picture of her to himself, especially the charm of that little fair head, so freely set on the shapely, girlish shoulders, and so full of childish brightness and good humor. The childishness of her expression, together with the delicate beauty of her figure, made up her special charm, and that he fully realized. But what always struck him in her as something unlooked for was the expression of her eyes, soft, serene, and truthful, and above all her smile, which always transported Levin to an enchanted world, where he felt himself softened and tender, as he remembered himself in some days of his early childhood. "Have you been here long?" she said, giving him her hand. "Oh, thank you," she added, as he picked up the handkerchief that had fallen out of her muff. I've not long, today. I arrived, answered Levin, in his emotion not at once understanding her question. I was meaning to come and see you, he said, and then, recollecting with what intention he was trying to see her, he was promptly overcome with confusion and blushed. I didn't know you could skate, and skate so well. She looked at him earnestly, as though wishing to make out the cause of his confusion. Your praise is worth having. The tradition is kept up here that you are the best of skaters, she said, with her little black-gloved hand brushing a grain of hoarfrost off her muff. Yes, I used once to skate with passion. I wanted to reach perfection. You do everything with passion, I think, she said, smiling. I should so like to see how you skate. Put on skates. Let us skate together. Skate together? Can that be possible? Thought Levin, gazing at her. I'll put them on directly, he squeaked. And he went off to get skates. It's a long while since we've seen you here, sir, said the attendant, supporting his foot and screwing on the heel of the skate. Except you, there's none of the gentlemen first-rate skaters. That be all right, said he, tightening the strap. Oh, yes, faster, please, answered Levin, with difficulty restraining the smile of rapture which would overspread his face. Yes, he thought. This now is life. This is happiness. Together, she said. Let us skate together. Speak to her now? But that's just why I'm afraid to speak, because I'm happy now. Happy in hope, anyway. And then... Oh, but I must. Away with weakness. Levin rose to his feet, took off his overcoat, and scurrying over the rough ice round the hut, came out on the smooth ice and skated without effort, as it were by simple exercise of will, increasing and slackening speed and turning his course. He approached with timidity, but again her smile reassured him. She gave him her hand, and they set off side by side, going faster and faster, and the more rapidly they moved, the more tightly she grasped his hand. With you I should soon learn. I somehow feel confidence in you, she said to him. And I have confidence in myself when you are leaning on me, he said, but was at once panic-stricken at what he had said and blushed. And indeed no sooner had he uttered these words when all at once, like the sun going behind a cloud, her face lost all its friendliness, and Levin detected the familiar change in her expression that denoted the working of thought. A crease showed on her smooth brow. Is there anything troubling you? Though I've no right to ask such a question, he added hurriedly. Oh, why so? No, I have nothing to trouble me, she responded coldly. And she added immediately, You haven't seen Mademoiselle Linon, have you? Not yet. Go and speak to her. She likes you so much. What's wrong? I have offended her. Lord, help me, thought Levin, and he flew towards the old Frenchwoman with the grey ringlets who was sitting on a bench. Smiling and showing her false teeth, she greeted him as an old friend. Yes, you see, we are growing up, she said to him, glancing towards Kitty. And growing old. Oh, tiny bear, you've grown so big now, pursued the Frenchwoman, laughing, and she reminded him of his joke about the 3 young ladies whom he had compared to the 3 bears in the English nursery tale. Do you remember? That's what you used to call them. He remembered absolutely nothing. But she had been laughing at the joke for 10 years now, and was fond of it. Now go and skate. Our Kitty has learned to skate nicely, hasn't she? When Levin darted up to Kitty, her face was no longer stern. Her eyes looked at him with the same sincerity and friendliness. But Levin fancied that in her friendliness there was a certain note of deliberate composure, and he felt depressed. After talking a little of her old governess and her peculiarities, she questioned him about his life. Well, surely you must be dull in the country in the winter, aren't you? She said. No, I'm not dull. I'm very busy. he said, feeling that she was holding him in check by her composed tone, which he would not have the force to break through, just as it had been at the beginning of the winter. "Are you going to stay in town long?" Kitty questioned him. "I don't know," he answered, not thinking of what he was saying. The thought that, if he were held in check by her tone of quiet friendliness, he would end by going back again without deciding anything, came into his mind, and he resolved to make a struggle against it. "How is it that you don't know?" "I don't know. It depends on you," he said, and was immediately horror-struck at his own words. Whether it was that she had heard his words, or that she did not want to hear them, she made a sort of stumble, twice struck out, and hurriedly skated away from him. She skated up to Mademoiselle Linon, said something to her, and went towards the pavilion where the ladies took off their skates. "My God, what have I done? Merciful God, help me, guide me," said Levin, praying inwardly, and at the same time, feeling a need of violent exercise, he skated about, describing inner and outer circles. At that moment, one of the young men, the best of the skaters of the day, came out of the coffee house in his skates with a cigarette in his mouth. Taking a run, he dashed down the steps in his skates, crashing and bounding up and down. He flew down, and without even changing the position of his hands, skated away over the ice. "Huh, that's a new trick," said Levin, and he promptly ran up to the top to do this new trick. "Don't break your neck! It needs practice!" Nikolai Sherbatsky shouted after him. Levin went to the steps, took a run from above as best as he could, and dashed down, preserving his balance in this unwanted movement with his hands. On the last step he stumbled, but barely touching the ice with his hand, with a violent effort recovered himself and skated off, laughing. "How splendid! How nice he is!" Kitty was thinking at that time as she came out of the pavilion with Mademoiselle Linon, and looked towards him with a smile of quiet affection, as though he were a favourite brother. "And can it be my fault? Can I have done anything wrong? They talk of flirtation. I know it's not he that I love, but still I am happy with him, and he's so jolly. Only, why did he say that?" she mused. Catching sight of Kitty going away, and her mother meeting her at the steps, Levin, flushed from his rapid exercise, stood still and pondered a minute. He took off his skates and overtook the mother and daughter at the entrance of the gardens. "Delighted to see you," said Princess Sherbatskaya. "On Thursdays we are home, as always." "Today, then?" "We shall be pleased to see you," the princess said stiffly. This stiffness hurt Kitty, and she could not resist the desire to smooth over her mother's coldness. She turned her head and with a smile said, "Goodbye, till this evening." At that moment, Stepan Arkadyevitch Oblonsky, his hat cocked on one side, with beaming face and eyes, strode into the garden like a conquering hero. But as he approached his mother-in-law, he responded in a mournful and crestfallen tone to her inquiries about Dolly's health. After a little subdued and dejected conversation with his mother-in-law, he threw out his chest again and put his arm in Levin's. "Well, shall we set off?" he asked. "I've been thinking about you all this time, and I'm very, very glad you've come," he said, looking him in the face with a significant air. Yes, come along," answered Levin in ecstasy, hearing unceasingly the sound of that voice, saying, "Goodbye till this evening," and seeing the smile with which it was said. "To the England or the Hermitage?" "Oh, I don't mind, whichever." "All right then, the England," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, selecting that restaurant because he owed more there than at the Hermitage, and consequently considered it mean to avoid it. "Have you got a sledge?" "Oh, that's first rate, for I sent my carriage home." The friends hardly spoke all the way. Levin was wondering what that change in Kitty's expression had meant, and alternately was assuring himself that there was hope, and then falling into despair, seeing clearly that his hopes were insane, and yet all the while he felt himself quite another man, utterly unlike what he had been before her smile and those words. Goodbye till this evening. Stepan Arkadyevitch was absorbed during the drive in composing the menu of the dinner. "You like turbot, don't you?" he said to Levin as they were arriving. "Huh?" responded Levin. "Turbot? Yes, I'm awfully fond of turbot, right, yes."